I have 9 o'clock, Jordan. Is that what everybody else has on there?
Yes, ma'am. And I started recording.
Okay, perfect. Then we are going to go ahead and get going. Good morning and welcome to the Houston Forensic Science Center Board of Directors meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order. It's 9 a.m. Just a couple of reminders for our virtual meeting today. There may be a delay in the audio as usual, just as a reminder. So after asking questions or making comments, just give it a couple seconds for people to unmute and speak. And then that way their video will appear. During each presentation, the speakers will make sure that after each point or different slides that if you guys have a question, that there will be opportunity for you to ask questions so that they just won't jump from one subject to another that they because of the delay and all. Let's see. And so here we go. Madam Secretary, would you please call the roll?
Yes, Madam Chair. Chairwoman Mitchell.
Here.
Vice Chair Lunchke.
Here.
Director Vasquez.
Present.
Director Hilder.
Present.
Director Medina.
Here.
Director Blancett.
Present.
Director Cohen.
Here.
Director Moore.
Present.
Director Huff.
Here.
Ex officio Calabrese.
Here. I think Director Calabrese is appropriate. That's the title, really.
Noted.
Thank you.
All right, great. It looks like we have a quorum, so we're going to continue. The HFSC meeting today is being conducted by video conference. The meeting is being held in compliance with Governor Abbott's suspension of certain provisions of the Texas Open Meetings Act in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency. The board is mindful of the health and safety of its members, staff, presenters, and the public. HFSC, like many local government entities in the state, is utilizing video conferencing today to limit in-person interactions in an effort to slow the spread of COVID-19. Alrighty, moving on to agenda item 3 is the public comment. We are providing 2 ways for the public to comment during this meeting in accordance with the governor's directive. First, the board meeting notice provided an email address for members of the public to send requests to speak during the public meeting comment period. These requests were required to be sent by Thursday, August the 13th at 9 a.m. Madam Secretary, did we receive any requests for comments by email?
No, Madam Chair, I did not receive any requests for comment via email.
Thank you. Okay, and then I also want to make sure that we're giving the public every opportunity to participate in this meeting. I will also open the floor now to provide time for anyone from the public who has joined the video conference and did not sign up in advance. If there is anyone who would like to speak at this time, please unmute yourself and state your name. Each member of the public will have 3 minutes to speak. Do we have anyone that's on, Madam Secretary?
No, Madam Chair, we do not have any members of the public here to speak publicly today.
Okay. I will leave this open just for a few more minutes, just in case somebody clicks in because they may be having difficulty connecting, and then we'll come back. Please remind me in a few minutes to come back so we can close the public meeting period. Okay, moving on to agenda 4. We've got our draft meeting minutes from July the 10th. This will be a voice vote, so everyone just take a second to review the meeting minutes, and then I will call for a motion in a second. Okay, do we have a motion for approval?
So moved. Lois Moore, so moved.
Okay, Lois Moore has made the motion. Do we have a second?
I second it.
Okay, Director Blancett seconded. Okay, wonderful. Madam Secretary, would you please call the roll for the voice vote?
Yes, Madam Chair. Chairwoman Mitchell.
Approve.
Vice Chair Lunchke.
Approve.
Director Vasquez,
I approve.
Director Hilder,
I approve.
Director Medina,
Approve.
Director Blanchett,
I approve.
Director Cohen,
Approve.
Director Moore,
I approve.
Director Huff.
I approve.
Okay, that is unanimous. The motion carries. Thank you very much. Okay, agenda item is the chair. Item 5 is the chair's report. I really don't have anything other than just one comment of, I think it's just in this time of, as we continue to face challenges with COVID-19, I want to just really commend HFSC and the staff on how they have continued to look for other ways and think outside of the box as we continue to, to do the work of HFSC, continue to try look at and plan how to address backlogs, how we plan to continue moving forward in spite of anyone becoming sick and then returning to work and catching up. And I think the entire facility organization has done a wonderful job. And I want to commend everyone on this. And hopefully I speak on behalf of all the other board members of saying thank you for everything that you have done and that you continue to do. Okay, as our corporate officers and staff members present today, you will see many of them sharing their screens. When that happens, the videos will go to the bottom of the screen if you're on a computer. All of you should have a virtual hand raise function that you can use in the event that you have a question. And then the presenters will also pause frequently for questions or comments. So we'll try and hold our questions during those designated times. There may be, again, some delay in the audio, and so hopefully it does happen, but people sometimes can speak over each other because of that delay, but we'll try and make sure everyone gets a chance to ask their question or to make their comment. Okay. That's the end of my report for agenda 5, item 5. Item number 6 is the report from Dr. Peter Stout, our president and CEO, and he will discuss technical updates, outreach efforts, staffing changes, and other corporate business items, including steps taken to operate safely and effectively during COVID-19. Dr. Stout.
Good morning, y'all. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. You see my slides okay?
Yes.
Hey, we're
Yes.
batting 1,000. All right. Great for Friday. All right. President's report. First thing after mentioning about COVID stuff, we are in a much better spot now than we were a few weeks ago. Right now, we have had 13 people that have tested positive, and we have one individual who is out. They're still experiencing pretty significant symptoms, and I expect will be out for at least a couple more weeks. We have been doing the weekly testing. We have it configured in the budget to handle that through this coming Monday, the 17th. I'm optimistic we've got a route to continue this, but it's not all nailed down yet, so I will let you know when we have that finalized. But for right now, the last time we'll be able to do that testing is this coming Monday. Just to give you a little perspective of what we've done with this, as of last week's, we just finished stuff just reported out for this week, but as of last week, we've had 159 staff tested, which is 79% of the entire staff. I think that is pretty much everybody who comes on site at least once a week has been tested at least once. Of those, 40 of them have now been tested 5 times. So really most of the people are getting repeatedly tested, which is what we're after. We've had 491 collections, 459 have been analyzed because we have had an ongoing issue with tubes that leak in shipment. Been going back and forth with Bodie about those tubes. We've tried taping, we've tried all kinds of various things on site because up until yesterday, and they let me know just yesterday, they have found an alternate tube source and they've done some shipping tests with those, and those new tubes don't seem to leak. So they're going to start using those on Monday. But basically, it has taken them quite a while to find an alternate tube. You can imagine why. Those tubes are getting used all over the country, all over the world. They're tough to come by. But that's where we're at on the COVID testing. Is there anything I can answer about the COVID testing that we've been doing? All right. Make sure I've got my clicker on the right screen here. So typical stuff. Amy C and Amy G and Tim will talk a little bit more about some of the detail under these numbers. One thing I will point out on here is the outsized production of toxicology. They have really been getting up to speed. New people are getting signed off in alcohols, and it's really showing. They don't typically represent, a third to a half of the work we report out in any given month, but they have really been producing an awful lot. Remember the latent print time, we calculate turnaround time based on reported. So that longer time is indicative that they are actually working some of the backlog cases. Same thing for biology and toxicology. Hopefully you've got a pretty good sense of some of this stuff with the weekly updates that I've been sending. Staffing wise, we're actually in pretty good shape. Right now we're sitting right at 200 staff. We have put it on there. We've got one toxicology fellow. It's actually a fellowship program with Army. I try not to hold it against Captain Key that he's Army, but but this actually worked out. So it's a 3-year fellowship. So that position is entirely covered by Army. They are here working with us on casework, research projects, validation. The point is they're mid-career officers. This is the same program that I came out of in the military that runs the drug screening laboratories for the military. Their goal is to try and get these mid-career officers more experience with a broader array of casework. We have 12 openings right now, 7 of which have offers accepted. Actually, I think 8 now because we had a toxicology candidate accept just this last week. So if you look at what we're actively recruiting for, the biology DNA analyst, we're attempting to recruit a experienced analyst there. Those are rare as hen's teeth, trying to find them. So we'll keep fishing there, but they are difficult to find experienced laboratory analysts there. We are recruiting for the manager of latent prints. We've got some candidates. We'll probably start interviewing soon on that. And of the toxicologists, that's probably where we've had the best luck. We are seeing some experienced toxicologists where we haven't before when we've been recruiting. So our intent was to hire 3 new grads. I think we've actually been able to hire 2 experienced toxicologists and 1 new grad. So that's actually pretty promising for us. And the tech lead, our current acting tech lead in training, she finishes up a required statistics course that we needed to get her here in the next week or 2. So she'll be able to step into fully functioning as the acting tech lead. Stuff's advancing nicely there, so I'm really optimistic that over the next few months we'll successfully be able to transition her into that position. But there's some work to do there. And then the 1C's drug analyst position, we're still holding on because in our world of COVID, I'm just not sure which way things are going. Not sure what to hire into that position, where to hire that position, those types of things. Any questions about staffing? All right, outreach stuff. I had one virtual meeting with council member Sally Alcorn, who's one of the new council members. Had a good conversation. And out of that, we are working on building a virtual lab tour that's an asynchronous video thing. I know a few of you still have not managed to get around to the new lab, so that'll be available for you as well as other council members, because it just, it's just not terribly workable to try and get people through the facility physically. Staff have really been doing a lot of work in outreach stuff, all virtually. Probably the most important in that list, I would say, is the STR mix training that we're doing for HPD investigators. They're experimenting with this as a virtual format and also trying to make recorded versions of this to be able to expand and be available when officers are able to use that training. But we've had Kelly Freeman doing stuff, Life of the DNA Analyst. James did training on controlled substances and dangerous drugs, again, for HPD. I love this Skype a scientist, Emma Roosh with George Mason University. Aha Moss is doing a math modeling speaker series with Claflin University in South Carolina. Keep in mind, a lot of what DNA does is probabilistics, a lot of mathematical modeling type stuff. Melissa Nally did a firearms presentation with CSAFE. That's the center out of University of Iowa that we do a lot of work with. And Melissa Rodriguez was presenting for a CSI high school at the University of Mississippi. So they're doing stuff all over the country. It's all virtual, and we're finding more opportunities for them to do this. Couple of miscellaneous things that I didn't know where else to put to catch up. The shooting range down in the basement is done, works. Well, you can see what it does to my hair. We have adequate ventilation through there. It clears nicely, so we can actually test shotguns for the first time in, well, HPD and HFSC's history to get them entered into NIBIN. So that's all done and working. We also are going to shift, because the Treasurer's report, particularly this time of year, we have money in the bank. We really don't have to make budgetary adjustments at this point in the year, so we're going to shift that Treasurer's report in the interest of trying to conserve time within the meeting. We'll do that quarterly unless there's something unusual that comes up. And then, down towards the end of the year where we have to make those budget modifications more often, you'll see David more often. And the last part on the finance side, our annual audit is ongoing at the moment. That's our external audit. And we do what's called a single audit because they audit both our corporate finances and our federal grants at the same time. Any questions on any of those things? All right. Well, that's good, because buckle up. They let me rant today, so look out. I promised I'd constrain my rants. So a couple of things have occurred to me as we've got new board members coming on, and it's been a while since I probably ranted at some of the older board members about the perspective of what forensics across the entire U.S. looks like and the framework that we're working in. And I think this is important because we are unusual, but it's really difficult to kind of understand just how unusual we are. So a few things in this. Couple of economists here more recently, Paul Speaker, who's out at University of West Virginia, and Jennifer Doliak have done, these are, in so much of the rest of the economy, there are lots of studies about return on investment and the economic impacts of things. In forensics, there is almost nothing except for the work that these two have done. So both of them have done here recently some work on the return on investment, the value that comes from forensic science results. I think all of us that work in forensics, we all kind of intuitively understand a scientific objective result has a lot of value, but I can't put my finger on how much that is. So these two have looked at very specific type of evidence, sexual assault kit evidence. And so this is basically all that we have any kind of information like this about, but it's pretty impressive. So they've done an analysis on this of basically economic return on investment, like you would expect in any kind of corporate circumstance. And out of what they've estimated for testing sexual assault kits, the return on investment on a sexual assault kit is somewhere between 10,000% to 64,000%. Now, those numbers are just silly big compared to what you would expect in most corporate return on investments. You think in the banking sector, a return on investment of 20% is enormous. So we're talking orders of magnitude more potential value in just sexual assault kit evidence. So you kind of put the dollar figure on that. They estimate a single CODIS entry not even the confirmed hit, just an entry of one of those profiles into CODIS is estimated to be worth about $20,000. So when you think about a lab our scale, right now, we are entering on average about 150 CODIS entries each month. So you can see it's a pretty sharp step up there in April as work shifted around to accommodate COVID. We were able to do more review that resulted in more CODIS entries. But if you take that $20,000 per CODIS entry, multiply that by how many we're doing, that's $3 million in value every month. So, and that's all that we really know about of these kinds of values. So even if you think half of that return on investment for other types of results, we're about 2,300 reports that we spit out a month. That would mean every month, roughly, we produce a value that's equivalent to our entire annual budget every month. So we're starting to see some economic numbers that help support what I think we intuitively understand of the rather outsized value that laboratories produce. And it is substantial, which is great. However, some of the things that we're up against. So I cite this study a lot. This is Bureau of Justice Statistics does this every 5 years. It's called the Census of Publicly Funded Crime Laboratories. So one of the things that I will point out is one of our challenges in forensic sciences is, yes, that is 2014 data. It was published in 2016, and that is the current data. There is no shortage of frustration to me out of that. I can go to the Department of Agriculture and I can determine and pull up last week, there were 17,354,000 eggs that were set in Texas hatcheries alone last week. To go over to the Department of Justice, the best I can do is a vague outline of the shadow of a sketch of maybe what's going on 6 years ago. That's not just pathetic. That is a tremendous detriment to trying to improve what's going on. We don't even understand what's going on. I get asked all the time, what is typical in forensics? We don't know. Across the board, we have a very, very poor understanding of what laboratories do in this country. Yeah, that frustrates me a lot. If you do look at these data, a few things that you can start to see in them. So there are 411 publicly funded crime labs that this survey was able to find. That's it. Those 409 labs that responded in 2014 processed 3.8 million requests in 2014. Think about the scale of some of these things. If you look down the left-hand column over here, more than half of the laboratories in the country have fewer than 24 employees. That means the average laboratory in this country has 35 employees and about a $3 million budget. That's the typical laboratory in this country. So us, at 200 employees and 30,000 requests a year, I think, but I cannot be sure, the only single laboratory in the country that is larger than us is the New York Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, which is enormous. It is the largest DNA operation on the planet, as best as anybody can tell. This single laboratory is basically the scale of a mid to large size state system. North Carolina laboratory system that's between 3 laboratories for the 10th most populous state in the country is about 200 employees and about 30,000 requests. DPS is, I think, 600 or 700 employees and about 80,000 to 90,000 requests a year. So, the second largest state in the country, we're a third to a half of the size of the entire state system that's spread between 16 labs. This is a very large lab, which gives us the ability to do a lot of things that a lot of labs just can't. But you also look over in this column that the annual operating budget combined between all those labs was about $1.7 billion in 2014. So just back of the envelope math, that means about $400 per request is what labs average work on in this country. So that's $400 to receive it, accession it, work it, test it, store it, testify about it, report it, everything. $400. For a little perspective, when I worked in the commercial sector as a toxicologist 15 years ago now, my time got charged out at $350 an hour. The scale of this is just missing zeros. This isn't multipliers off. This is missing zeros of where things should be. Something that I think escapes a lot of particularly kind of obvious attention. We all focus a lot on DNA. All the studies are about DNA, particularly sexual assault kits. Heinous crime, extremely important evidence. But what flows through laboratories across the country is drugs. Drugs make up about a third of the work that goes through any typical laboratory in the country, us included. Next after that, latent prints, somewhere between 4% and about 24-ish% of the work that goes through a laboratory. Toxicology is typically about a quarter of what goes through labs. So you can see in the graph, controlled substances, toxicology. This here of convicted offender arrestee samples are database samples. Those are the reference buccal swabs that go into CODIS as the reference profile. Typically in most states, there's one laboratory that's a state level lab or a federal level lab that does that. So DPS does all of that for the state of Texas. We don't do any database work. It's a lot of profiles. It's highly automated. They're highly consistent samples. Any questions so far as I get wound up in my rants here?
Yes, Dr. Stout, this is Stacy. I do have a question. With the smaller labs, how do their backlogs, it's probably not even a fair question to ask about comparison between us and them and backlogs and all. I mean, are we looking, I know we do have some challenges and I imagine they do as well with 35 employees on the average and the request, but how are those smaller labs? Do we even know that information to be able to try and compare or either do some sort of, just kind of even looking at what's going on?
There are some very sketchy data about that. And generally speaking, we're actually in pretty good shape compared to that. I can dig some of that out. The Foresight data. So that's a project that Paul Speaker runs in West Virginia that he tries to assemble some economic and production data around laboratories. It's not a perfect data set, but it does at least give some comparison of backlog and percent of cases that are backlogged. And actually, we do pretty darn good in comparison to most laboratories. One thing that I do make sure I point out is DNA work for most casework labs sits somewhere between 2 and about 13% of labs, about 10% of the work on average. That's it. For all of that value that we were talking about at the start, that's only about 10% of the work. But to that point of backlog, Senator Grassley in 2018 was critical of what's called the capacity enhancement backlog reduction, or I'm trying to remember the other name for that act. But basically, this is the source of federal funding that comes for laboratories. So he had the GAO dig into the CBER program and pulled a bunch of information out. We were one of the laboratories that was interviewed in this. And what they published in 2018 was one of these notable parts. Federal government has invested $500 million from 2011 to 2016 exclusively in DNA. And across that time, backlogs went up. So in asked, basically the question was, what the heck are these laboratories doing? They're wasting all this money and still losing ground. Well, another little quirk that Paul Speaker has found in looking at laboratory production is there is a significant elasticity in laboratory demand. For every 1% the laboratory's turnaround time goes down, the number of requests they get goes up by 1.4%. So there is an enormous pent-up latent demand for forensic science evidence because it's so valuable. So as any laboratory starts to get more efficient, everybody starts to go, hey, I can get a result, and starts pushing results that they never asked for before. That seems to be what's happened here, because across that time frame, the number of requests that laboratories are able to do went up quite a bit, but the number of requests went up even more. So the backlogs went up even more. So it's pretty sobering what we're up against, that the only place that has any federal money, that much investment, only sees things becoming more backlogged. So the most probably current kind of widespread report that came out just at the end of last calendar year, right at the end of December. They announced this thing almost on Christmas Eve. Kind of says trying to bury it if that timing plays out. But this was a report that NIJ was mandated to do a needs assessment of forensic sciences under the Justice for All Reauthorization Act of 2016. So they were told to do it in 2016. They managed to get it published in 2018, and it's basically the most current data in it is 2017. Again, we're doing good to have a picture of stuff 6 years ago. But in this, some pretty sobering statistics in it. In 2017, they were estimating that there was a budget shortfall in laboratories of at least $640 million. You add on training demands onto that, and this hasn't gotten any smaller. Probably right now, we're looking at $1 billion a year hole in what forensic laboratories need across the country. That's huge. Things like controlled substances, the analysis of drugs, and toxicology increased dramatically. 37% for controlled substances, tox increased 25%. This is the impact of the opioid epidemic. But lab budgets grew less than 3% on average across the entire country. So yeah, you want to talk real backlogs, it's drugs and toxicology across the country are enormous backlogs, particularly in drugs. They estimate there are thousands of additional practitioners needed in any given year. They point out there is federal funding available for DNA, but they very explicitly point out what I keep trying to tell everybody and make sure that particularly decision makers understand. Outside of DNA, there are no federal dollars available for any other discipline other than DNA. There is nothing. And the scale of what's even available for DNA is missing zeros of where it should be. So it's a pretty sobering landscape of where we're at. We actually, in the scale that we're at, we're able to accomplish things that your typical laboratory can't even touch. Blinds and some of the data stuff that we do and e-discovery. We can do that, but that's because of the scale we're at. Not because these other labs don't want to. When you've got 9 people in the lab, how are you going to do that? So, kind of sobering circumstance, but it leads me to the other part that I sent you the concept around this of how in the world, given nobody's coming to our rescue, how do we try and continue to make these valuable results more available, push them into areas where obviously at this time in our history, societally, for vast swaths of our population, they don't trust the justice system. And these types of objective scientific results are how we rebuild that. So how do we get it there? Over the 20 odd years that I have run laboratories, yeah, there are sciencey things that go wrong. You can't ignore those. STR mix and interpretation of mixtures in DNA. Sciencey issue. Can't ignore that one. Important thing to work on. But the vast majority of things that I have seen create chaos and havoc in laboratories, result in egregious miscarriages of results, aren't science. They are mundane, tedious, logistical things of getting the right sample in the right tube with the right test 1 million times a year. So law enforcement has traditionally housed property. That's stuff that goes back 150 years. But as we have become ever more dependent on forensic science evidence, that property, once it's tagged into evidence, is becoming less and less really something that law enforcement has control over. Once that stuff's tagged into evidence, the DAs and the defense, prosecution and defendants and victims and laboratories all have an interest in what that evidence is, what's happening to it. And ultimately, it's the scientific results that come from that evidence that probably create more value in this than a television sitting in a room. So property is huge risk. It is very high risk. Stuff goes wrong all the time. It is a daunting challenge of how to manage it. Nobody likes property management. But we are getting to a point in the laboratory that we can't get any more efficient unless the stuff that comes into the laboratory is better. So I wanted to come talk with you a bit about this because I have been kind of wandering around this conversation for a while with conversations about laboratory consolidation. Often this has been my reply to that is I see the logic of laboratory consolidation, but the value for the entire system to consolidate the laboratories is this big. The effect of consolidating and fixing property management has a much larger effect for the entire system. So Ramit keeps after me about, don't bury the lead. This is the concept. A consolidated city-county property evidence management, some version of an independent civilian oversight to improve the disposal of the evidence, increase the efficiencies for the crime labs, the DAs, the courts, better trust in that evidence, better management of that evidence that ultimately results in better outcomes for the entire system. That's the goal. Things that sit behind that, this kind of thing. This is a conundrum that we face 100 times a day. This probably was controlled substances evidence, manila envelope kind of packaging, a lot of what we see. A proper evidentiary seal looks like this one on this end. So there's tamper evident tape. There is initials and dates that extend across the tape onto the packaging. The idea being trying to create a seal on that if someone were to try and tamper with it, it would be difficult to do that without it being obvious. Great. Here's the end of the envelope that actually opens. What do I do with this? Now I'll tell you, if we were to reject this, we would grind the justice system in Harris County to a halt because we receive almost nothing completely appropriately packaged. That's also every laboratory in the country. Now, does this really compromise the evidence? I don't know. It could, but what do I do with this stuff in the process? Now, I will argue, while this is frustrating and it's easy to get mad at the person who packaged this up, really, this is an issue of the engineering of the packaging. It's too difficult. There's too many ways to get it wrong. It should be simpler and easier for the person in the field to use it. At the property room, when this is getting checked in, that's the point to correct this issue, not by the time it makes it to the laboratory, not by the time it makes it to the court. But it is stuff that is this kind of mundane that bogs everything down. An example of the logical outcome that can come to this. Any questions so far? Like I say, this is a rant. You wind me up, I get going.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Stout, so basically on the picture on the slide before, did you go back, that the officer's initials and the date and the time should be on the other end of the package as well. So it
Right.
should be.
It should be on.
Is that what you're saying?
Right. It needs to be on this end over here as well.
Mm-hmm.
Or really, more ideally, the way this packaging is put together to begin with means I only have to seal it on one end,
Right.
not give the opportunity to think I need to seal it on both ends. And then it's much more obvious that consistently and systematically, this is how you package, not here's an envelope, go figure it out yourself.
Okay. All right, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, just to show where the
Yeah.
appropriate packaging should be.
I mean,
Thank you.
if this package were completely, actually accurately sealed, it would have that same kind of thing on both ends.
Okay, and then you would, when it gets to the crime lab, then the analyst opens it probably from one of the sides, correct? They do
Right. So
not-
an analyst usually will go into this and they'll make a cut along one of the
Yeah.
sides. So that is a typical practice is I don't disturb a pre-existing seal. I leave that seal there so that when that evidence ends up in court, the person who applied that original seal can identify that seal and it's clear that that seal was intact when it goes to court. So they would make another cut in this, pull the evidence out. When they put it back in there, they would make their own seal, initial and date that seal over that opening that they made.
Got it. Thank you.
Those are good questions. And we spend an enormous amount of time documenting things like this, putting it into reports, remediating these kinds of things. And that's waste. It's time that shouldn't have to be spent.
Peter,
Yeah.
it's Ellen Cohn. I guess I missed something when you're just talking about the sealing. So if I was the original investigator and I put the information in the packet and put my seal on it and my name on it, okay, that's fine. And then it gets to court or wherever it's going, somebody else opens it up, Peter does, and opens it up on the other side of the envelope and whatever, takes it out and examines it and then puts it back in again with your seal, right?
Right.
So what I originally put in could conceivably have been tampered with by you.
Correct.
So my seal is really not effective.
It is part of the story. The other part that goes with it is the chain of custody. So the chain of custody is intended to be the explicit, step-by-step, inclusive handling of that piece of evidence. So if you originally had this evidence, you put it in the envelope, you made these seals. You then sign that piece of evidence over to me. So I'm the next one that's in that list. So you know it was me. I go in there, I pull the evidence out, I do my analysis, I put it back in, I put my seal on there. So at court, and this is part of what the lawyers here can probably explain better than me, remember, nerd, not lawyer, is this is part of offering this evidence publishing the evidence into evidence. I guess that's the way it's put. Basically that you have to testify, I recognize that piece of evidence because that's my initials and dates on there. I recognize this piece of evidence because that's my initial and date on there. What did you do to the evidence? Well, I took it out, I analyzed it, I did these things. So if there were tampering with it, it doesn't necessarily prevent it, but the idea is it creates the circumstance that you could tell where and who may have tampered with that evidence. Does that help answer your question?
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
So evidence seals and chain of custody are fundamental essentials to how evidence is recognized as reliable and valid. If they're hosed up, there is more potential and there's more argument that it could have been unwittingly or unknowingly tampered with. So a bit of an example of potential implications of this. So this is when I first showed up at HFSC in 2015. Just before I showed up, there had been an incident in toxicology where an officer had submitted a breath case and a blood case inverted. Laboratory realized it at that point. The practice was at that point was to go ahead and process the cases while they waited for the officer to go fix the issue. Okay, fine. However, a couple of twists and turns that happened, and I could spend a whole couple other hours explaining this entire sequence that happened because it created a serious problem at Texas Forensic Science Commission because the laboratory ultimately reported out the cases inverted. So ultimately, this entire sequence starts because of mishandled evidence, misidentified evidence. As simple as that. Out of that, HFSC ended up in serious trouble with TFSC. There was a pretty narrowly we escaped being de-accredited by TFSC in this incident. So when I came in, I started looking at this and realizing we had an awful lot of evidence that was coming in with basically as bad as this, saying Martha on the tube and Bob on the paperwork. Within the case, self-conflicting information. I really don't know what I'm handling. So I said, okay, if we got something like that, if it's not fundamentally appropriate to be testing it for toxicology and it's not unambiguously identified, we're going to stop right there. We're going to return the evidence. We'll send them a nice little letter that says your evidence has been rejected and here's the reason why. When you get it figured out, come talk to us. We'll take care of it. When we started doing that, back in July of 2015, we started rejecting nearly half of all the toxicology evidence that came in. I'll let that number sink in. Half of everything that came in was not unambiguously identified. Over the next about 6 months, we spent an awful lot of time with HPD trying to train officers, changing policies, working through stuff. I had a few instances in there of courts threatening to toss me in jail for obstruction and all kinds of things because were all livid with us for rejecting this evidence. In about January, it became obvious that we had to do something other than just policy changes. So we had a couple of months in there, and then another story of past choices about analytical instrumentation that basically destroyed the alcohol instrumentation we had, and we were shut down for a couple of months in there. That was also painful. But we redesigned and re-engineered the kit. The kit that was being used originally demanded that the officer write down no fewer than 6 places the defendant's name. So guess what happened? They'd write the wrong name in one spot, and then we'd have Bob on the paperwork and Martha on the tube. So we redesigned the kit so that they have a sticker that they put on the tube that links it to the form. They write the name in one place, and as long as they've got the right case number on there, we're good. We launched that new kit in May of 2016, and you can see the decrease in rejection rates here. We managed to get that down to about 10%, but it kept going back and forth because what I discovered was, as HPD, we originally designed the kit and then handed it over to HPD to procure. But when they'd run out of kits, they'd go out for a competitive bid to renew the kit, and they kept changing things about the kit that didn't work. So I said, fine, it's actually less expensive for us to have the kit correct and pay for the kit than pay for 1 or 2 of these errors, because they become really difficult for us when something's screwed up. So we spend about $20,000, $25,000 a year on kits for HPD in order to try and keep this where it's at. 6 years later, we are still batting somewhere between a 2 and 6% rejection rate, which I would argue is still 10 times what actually is necessary to be efficient. I'll talk a little bit more about the economics behind that. But this is one type of evidence. This same kind of exercise needs to be done with hundreds of other kinds of evidence, because this same type of thing lurks behind every other kind of evidence that's collected and managed through the system. So then you add on to this where HPD's property room is at. So there are something in the neighborhood of 80 odd law enforcement agencies in Harris County. Yes, they are all over the place. Every one of them's got a little property operation. Every one of them does something different. Every one of them is vulnerable. Every one of them has different stickers and policies. Drives the DAs and the courts nuts. HPD's property room, for as many issues as we have, is actually in Harris County by far the best property operation. But something that is desperately necessary there is they are drowning. If you look at the number of items that they receive versus the number of items they are able to dispose of, right now that is a 7-to-1 ratio. They have 7 items come in for every 1 item that they can dispose of. That is the property equivalent of a nuclear meltdown. That will destroy any system, no matter how competent. They are getting buried, and it is going up. You look at some of the best property operations around the country, that ratio is somewhere between about 0.7 and about 0.9. So they actually are able to discard more items of evidence than they receive. It's the only way you manage the inventory. It's the only way that you can reliably identify the items of evidence that are actually important. What happens when it's 7-1? They're spending more time shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic trying to find places to put boxes than they are actually able to manage the real evidence. This is a serious, serious issue for them, that whatever the solution in this is, that's got to get fixed. So if you think about property management affects law enforcement, even if they're not managing it, if it doesn't work well, they lose enormous amounts of time to an officer sitting in the property room, dealing with paperwork, shuffling stuff in and out. That's not an officer out on patrol. That's not an officer doing the stuff that we desperately need officers to be able to do. For laboratories, poor quality evidence in means poor quality results out. If that evidence is contaminated, damaged, destroyed, I can't fix it, regardless how good my science is. Just can't. So we lose time to remediation of those things that we can remediate, and there is a serious risk of poor outcomes for the lab. So that toxicology case, switched item 6 years ago. The final resolution to that came about 2 months ago in a decision from the Texas Supreme Court. That switched item went all the way to the Texas Supreme Court before it was finally actually resolved, the outcome of that. That is a huge risk to the laboratory. Prosecution. Get them going about evidence handling. You haven't even heard a rant yet. Inconsistent policies, poor quality evidence, compromises cases all the time. They have a huge bottleneck in the transfer of evidence. This compromises their ability, and now they have a serious issue. There are 80,000 cases backlogged in Harris County thanks to COVID. That's not getting any smaller. Defense, same thing, destroys cases if the evidence isn't handled right. And this also is a place where they have serious difficulties with disclosure and the visibility and transparency of the entire system. For victims and defendants, simply means they might not get the right result. Good, bad, otherwise, whether you're victim or defendant, you haven't the foggiest idea what's going on with this. It is a huge detriment to people's ability to trust the system. So what I gave you, and I'm happy to chat about, and this is a chat at this point. I'm not asking you necessarily to decide anything. This is a years-long process. There is nothing easy, short, light, or anything about this. But trying to step through, negotiate what this governance structure looks like. I've got some ideas, but there's multiple ways to slice that. There has to be some kind of evidence management task force that includes the prosecutors, includes law enforcement, includes the courts, includes the laboratories. If nothing else happens out of that, and that does, that's a significant win. Somehow that disposal issue has to get solved. And it's worse here than it seems almost anywhere else in the state. So it's not simply a state law thing, it's a Harris County thing. But everybody's got to be at that table to how you systematize and sustainably manage standardization of evidence and disposal. There's some facilities that need to be updated, but this really isn't about facility. This is about the management practices. There's some facility things that need to be improved, but by and large, this isn't about building one big warehouse. This is about how stuff gets managed. It's process and policy. Janet, got a question? You're muted at the moment.
Yes, I noticed that you're asking to combine essentially the property operations of HPD, which is the Houston Department, with Harris
Right.
County. What percentage of the management issues do you think would be resolved by that kind of combination?
So things at the simplest. the potential to be able to standardize how evidence is packaged and collected. I think there are some significant redundancies and cost savings that could come out of those. If nothing else, HPD and HCSO. You look at what I think is about the budgetary slice of HPD's operation compared to things like Las Vegas PD, which is a comparably sized property room, if not a little bit bigger. There's a big gap between where Las Vegas functions at a very high level on a much smaller budget and where HPD's at. So I think it looks like there's significant money in that combination that could be saved. There's significant money that can be turned to better process. There are just some management culture things that I think should happen in there. I think there is a citizen trust level of making this more transparent. I mean, there's a similar exercise that what happened with HFSC. Property's not that different. And I think the ability to help, particularly in this time, make this more transparent, more publicly accountable, has a real advantage. So yeah, the first that I pose is HCSO and HPD, because that probably accounts for about 80% of the evidence that moves around the county. Then there's the constables, which probably is another big chunk. And then there's the myriad smaller law enforcement agencies that have a property closet someplace. So that's kind of the end of it. But I think if you can get HPD and HCSO combined, figure out the economies of scale, figure out the processes, figure out the management structure there, and then basically create a lease cost, a cost per unit per time that would allow Bel Air or PD to be able to say, I can then store evidence in that for 15 cents a month kind of thing, whatever that number is. So you don't incorporate them in that kind of, so the initial governance structure allows for that flexibility, but doesn't necessarily commit those smaller agencies into it until they come to it. I don't think it's probably worthwhile trying to fold all of these 80 different agencies into it at the start if you get HPD and HCSO there to begin with.
Okay, that was something I was wondering if you were headed toward eventually.
Yeah.
If there's sufficient excess capacity built into the system up front.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have your arms around what the ultimate capacity would have to be if a plan like this were to go forward?
So HPD's current property room is about 1.1 million items. I have less visibility on HCSOs, but HCSO is about half the scale of HPD, kind of writ large. So my guess is between them and the constables is maybe another million items. HPD receives about 100 and, what was it here? HPD receives about 170,000 items a year. So CSO and the constables is probably another, say, 200,000 items. Las Vegas PD receives about 200,000 items a year, and they're about 1.6 million. I mean, this combined thing would be a very large operation, but just like the lab, we're a very large laboratory in the country. There are some things that can be done at that scale that you just can't do with one dude in a closet in the back.
All right.
Those are good questions. Frank, I think you had a question?
Yes, Peter. On a similar matter of redundancy, well, many years ago, I remember when they used to arrest, when HPD would arrest somebody, they would take them to the HPD jail to process them, and then they would transport them to Harris County Jail.
Yep.
Process them again.
Yep.
Did that issue ever get resolved where Harris County was trying to combine?
That is the Joint
HPD?
Processing Center, which has been, and certainly that's one that when I talk with, because I've talked with county folks, I've talked with city folks, I've talked with DA, I've talked with HPD and CSO. That's kind of the model that everybody's got in their head is the Joint Processing Center. So that is a joint city county jail intake facility. So like right now, all toxicology samples are collected actually at the JPC, whether it's constable, HPD, HCSO, They all go to the JPC and they collect them there. So back to Janet's question, one tiny, tiny part of this, but if I take a potential DUI to the JPC to collect them, if I'm HPD, they get the collector who's there is an HPD employee. They do the collection. They take the HPD designed kit that we make for them. They collect them in that. If they're CSO, they then have to go over to this stack of tubes, grab 2 tubes out of that, different paperwork, different collection stuff. If they're one of the constables, it's this set of racks over here to do that. If it's Bel Air, it's this. If so, every one of them, even though it's the same blood samples, same analysis is going to happen, every one of them has a different packaging, even though it's in the same facility. Why not standardize that collection so that then that analyst there, much more reliable in being able to complete it correctly. You design something that makes it easy for them. That gets the officer through there faster and back out doing what the officer needs to be doing. The laboratories get something that's much more predictable. The DAs get something that's much more predictable. Those are the advantages I think we could get out of this in that combined operation.
Okay. Dr. Stout, Dr. Huff has a question as well. Dr. Huff does.
Yes, ma'am. I think you're muted.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I realize I have an old version of Teams and I don't have the raise hand function. I have a very basic question. When you talk about disposing of evidence, do you mean sifting through it and understanding what is important and what is not? What are the criteria for disposal, I guess is my question.
Yeah. So disposition of evidence is how it gets technically referred to. You can think of, say, like drug evidence. You get a lot of that drug evidence. Depending on the charges, depending on the state of prosecution, depending on the ultimate adjudication, there are time limits for how long that evidence needs to be stored. So you think a homicide, basically you're going to store evidence associated with a capital murder basically forever. That's appropriate. But drug cases, there may be stuff that you can dispose of within a year or two. If that's stacking up, that's taking space, that's taking management, that's taking basically resources that then you don't have to understand and make sure that the homicide evidence is appropriately stored and protected. So it is a constant maintenance effort of determining what evidence is eligible for destruction, destroying it appropriately, and getting it on out of there so that you maintain the space and the resources in the facility.
Okay, so it's just really a matter of the legality of how long you need to keep something.
And there's involvement from the DAs, there's involvement from the courts. Some of it requires a court order. The DAs often have to file for that court order. There's a lot of intricacies to it to protect, not losing evidence. I mean, there's been some doozy headlines not that long ago. I think Precinct 4, pretty sure it was 4, managed to accidentally dispose of 60,000 drug cases. Oops. Basically, they didn't accidentally lose it. They destroyed evidence without the proper authorization for that, is what really occurred there. So that's the kind of stuff that requires the structure to do that. The institutionalized, systematized way of doing that just doesn't exist right now.
Okay, thank you.
Janet? You're muted again.
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble here. That brings up a question I have about the process in which the evidence is disposed of. All the evidence would have to have some kind of status associated in terms of its legal status, whether or not it can be disposed of or kept.
Yes.
Will the data management around evidence be included as part of a 10-step plan over 4 years? And does it also include need to have the input of the DA's office, for example? Does it are more than just Harris County Sheriff's Office and HPD to be involved in this?
I think you kind of broke up there a little bit, but I think if I understood your question, it's the data management around ensuring that we understand what evidence, its status, where it's at, its eligibility for destruction or requirements for storage. I think the short answer to that is yes. In this, one of the steps that I'm contemplate in this is one, a migration audit from one set of management to this, that basically we need to go through and touch everything, understand what's there, verify, and actually HPD has the, if you will, industry standard. See previous rant that there really aren't industry standards. But they have what's called an evidence management system, EMS. It's actually a reasonable system, could probably work with that. But yes, there is a significant IT need around this. And I think there are some significant IT improvements that are needed in order to better manage the logistics of this.
Okay.
Walmart, Amazon, lots of places manage something fantastically more complicated. It can be done. We need to apply that kind of stuff here.
Okay. The part of the question that I also had was, does another organization in the justice system also be involved, such as the DA's office, to make sure that the system they think the evidence is in actually the case?
Yeah, again, you're kind of breaking up a little bit there, but I think the question you had was around the DA's involvement. Yes,
Yes.
the DA's have to be involved. And I do think trying to combine and integrate systems between some of the DA's systems and these to help automate and improve the reliability of those data transfers as well. Because right now, a lot of it moves on, somebody makes up an Excel spreadsheet, prints out the spreadsheet, scans the spreadsheet and sends it to somebody. There's lots of holes in places where things can get lost, things can get twisted up, not work out. So yes, DAs have to be involved in this.
Yeah, Dr. Stout, you had mentioned that there's not really any best practices. NIST is in the process of developing a best practice guidelines for the evidence management and the life cycle of the evidence from collection all the way through disposition, because it is a complicated process that's based upon many different things, you know, the statute, you know, the case itself, and has a lot of input. So that's coming, but it's still being
You'd
worked.
know about that because you're on that steering committee, aren't you?
Yes, I am, and it's being worked on. It's in the process of being written, because I've looked at a couple of drafts right now, so it's getting there.
So one last just kind of thought experiment example to walk through to just hopefully drive home what I think are some of the importance and economics around this. So back to that toxicology thing. 6 years to get resolved. Switch sample. Simple as that. If we have a correctly submitted toxicology kit, it takes us about 6 minutes to receive it, accession it, set it up for toxicology. 6 minutes. If it is an incorrect kit, it takes us about an hour to get that to report, because we've got a lot more we've got to record about it. Seems like there's always some creative way that it gets broken. Got to figure that out, how to detail that, all those kinds of things. Probably, and these are guesses, it's going to take that officer at least 2 hours to come fix it, because now they've got to go back to the property room, deal with the property room, which is never a fast process, get the thing fixed, and then get back out. For the lawyers in the courts, probably at least 3 hours. I mean, I've got one example where it took 6 years, because now they're going to have to deal with the fact that the evidence was imperfect to begin with. How did it get remediated? Who fixed it? Why did this suddenly magically become okay? The questions that exist around that. So the time between 6 minutes for correct and now 6 hours for something wrong for the system stacks up quick. Right now we got a 6% rejection rate. So that means for us 390 rejections per year. Multiply that out, that's about 2,400 labor hours. So right there, one type of evidence, this much of the picture, that's an entire person in the system every year just trying to fix 6% rejection rate. If it were a tenth that starts to be something that's much more efficient. And that's not even talking about those costs associated with an unjust outcome, one way or the other. Has to be some mechanism in this. And like I say, if there is nothing else that gets solved out of this other than better disposition, that will be a win. That's got to get fixed because that creates the opportunity for these minor errors that then explode into something that takes 6 years to get solved. I think this would be a place where there is a dramatic and visible improvement for people to see in the trust in the system. And I think everybody can kind of agree on this too. This isn't some of these other really sticky ideas and concepts out there. This is pretty straightforward stuff. Like I say, there's Amazons and Walmarts that do this all the time. Property is a high risk thing. Stuff goes wrong. Drugs get stolen, cash gets stolen. You've got to have hard systems around this. But it's not a risk that law enforcement has to take. Why stick law enforcement with a risk that they don't have to have? Why not distribute this risk someplace else? Put it in a place that's designed to deal with that kind of risk. So, I have ranted plenty. Happy to answer any questions. Good questions so far. Stacy?
Yes. Can you talk just a little bit about the history, because I some little background, some historical knowledge, because I believe when HFSC was founded and moved and migrated from HPD, was not the property room piece part of that, or there was discussion potentially?
Yeah, as I understand, there was discussion around that. I've not quite been able to talk a little bit with Scott Hochberg. Certainly recollections of conversations with Dan, that it was a conversation about just where do we go with the property room. If you go back and look at the Bromwich report, property was a significant part of the Bromwich report. There were serious issues, and probably, I'm starting to see some nodding heads there of, yeah, everybody is aware of that history of property challenges. And that's what led to the building of the now not so new property room for HPD, which is a very good facility. No question, it is a good facility. It is also over capacity. It is past full. They are having to move stuff around to be able to wedge stuff in. That's not where you want to be. So it's not that there has not been improvement on it. It's the reality is 10% error rate is way too high for the system to tolerate. They went from something far higher than that down to about a 10% error rate, which is tremendous, but it's got to go farther for the system to actually work appropriately.
Okay, thank you.
There's nothing fast about this. I figure this is at least a 5-year arc trying to do this. So like I say, I've had enough conversations, and quite honestly, post George Floyd, I have seen more traction around this idea than I did before. And because there have been more conversations, I want to make sure you are aware of some of the crazy things that I think up as some of these conversations are proceeding in a few places, and we'll see what comes out. Any other questions? All right, well, nobody fell asleep in my rant, so my rant must have been kind of okay. This is one of those spots that there's issues. We know how to fix it. We have an obligation to go fix this.
Yeah.
I'll shut up now. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Stout. All righty. Madam Secretary, has anyone else come on the call that would like to say something with under the public comment, because that's still open?
No, Madam Chair, we have not been contacted by any members of the public, and we haven't had anyone join this meeting to speak.
Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and close the public comment period now. I also would like to announce Director Vasquez left the meeting. She had some connection difficulties, and so she left the meeting at about 9:18. I did not interrupt Dr. Stout because at that time we had a quorum with her leaving, and we still have a quorum now. But I wanted to make that announcement that Director Vasquez had to leave due to some connection issues. I also would like to acknowledge Mr. Darrell Davis. He is attending our meeting as well. He's part of our technical advisory group. Welcome, Mr. Davis. We're glad that you're here with us. And if there are no other questions for Dr. Stout, we're going to move on to agenda item number 7, which is the monthly operations report from Dr. Castillo, who is the Vice President and COO, and she will review the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on laboratory operations and an update on backlogs in the forensic biology and DNA section and in our latent print sections. Dr. Castillo, we'll turn it over to you now.
Good morning. Can y'all see my screen okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so the first is the company overview. For today, I'm actually going to be going into more detail for each section. So the main takeaway from this slide is that over the last couple months, including July, we've actually been either holding steady or slightly decreasing in our overall backlog in the company. It's been a small decrease, but it is exciting we're going in that direction given everything that's going on right now. The main factors contributing to the decrease last month is the big increase in the amount of work that the toxicology section has been putting out, which has helped dive into their backlog a little bit. And also the focus on the outsource reviews in biology, which are the CODIS entries that Peter had mentioned. Those have also helped last month decrease the overall backlog. And we are seeing this continue into this month. So I am anticipating being able to share more of this good news with you next month. So for this month, I'm going to have a few things to go over. One is a schedule for the operations report for this month and the next 3 months. The other is an overview of COVID-19 impacts to the lab sections, because we are still dealing with that. We are still not at full staff in the sections. And the last is a backlog update on forensic biology and DNA, and also latent prints. So we're going to try something new with the operation report highlights, which is to plan out for a few months what our topics are going to be. We're really hoping that this is helpful for everyone to see what's coming down the pipe, because we know that there's a lot of different conversations that need to happen and a lot of activity in all of our sections. Of course, if something urgent comes up, we will adjust the schedule. But right now, I'll go through what our plan is through November. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to go through some lab updates for COVID-19 impact and any other major things that are happening in the sections. We're also going to take a deeper dive into the latent prints backlog. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on it, but we have the manager of this section, Tim Schmall, who's going to talk about some detail. And then our project engineer, Amy Grimaldi, who's going to go into some more detail about our plan for mitigating the backlog that we're dealing with in that section. Next month, we're going to focus on toxicology. We've talked a bit about toxicology in the past. As y'all know, we've seen almost a doubling in the number of blood alcohol requests that we get in a month, and that has impacted the section. However, we're really grateful that the city was able to fund more positions in that section. And so what we're going to give you an update on is how we're doing in the backlog, how we're doing with the hiring. And the manager of that section, Dr. Lee, is going to give a presentation on a 3-year plan that she and the section have worked on, that not only deal with the backlog, but also deal with bringing on the new instruments that we have and new drug testing methods. And then in October, we'll go back to forensic biology. We will have been outsourcing by that time. We started this month, so we'll have some updates on that. We're also going to have some early updates on the impact of StarMix on our capacity in the section. And at that time, we're going to be starting another round of training. And so we'll have a lot of updates on what we've done to do a better job this time as far as timeline and training, since we know how much that impacts our ability to get work done. And then in November, I'm going to go back to section updates, my plan right now is about every 3 months to actually go through all of the sections. Typically, I've used the highlights to highlight areas we're struggling, which is really important information. But I think it's also important for y'all to see some of the great work that sections are doing and some of the areas where we have some good accomplishments to share. And so as long as nothing else comes up, I'm going to try to plan that every 3 months we'll go through the lab as a whole, not just one section. I do plan that month to have some staff presentations from some of our support groups, such as Lean Six Sigma. You'll hear from Amy Grimaldi today, but we do have 2 people in that section, and they do a lot of support work for our sections. So I think it would be great for them to give you or just do some education on everything that goes on in that department, and also our research and development. That group in November will actually be wrapping up their first research grant. So I think they'll have some exciting updates on that. And they're also the group that manages our laboratory information management system that everybody but biology uses. And so it'll be a good opportunity for them to show the support work that they do that keeps our sections running. Does anybody have any questions about the timeline? Okay. Sorry, it's hard to find where to advance my slides on 3 monitors. Okay, so now we're going to go into the section impacts from COVID. So the first section we're going to talk about is client services and case management. So this division is the face of the Houston Forensic Science Center. They have a long list of tasks that they take care of for us, including all of our document release, records requests. But today we're going to specifically talk about the evidence piece that they manage. So this is the division that goes to the property room and picks up all the items of evidence that we need for this section. That includes some of what Peter was talking about with rejecting evidence that we shouldn't bring. So it's not just I'm going to go pick up the evidence process. It is a process. They're also the ones who take all the evidence back to the property room once HFSC has finished it. They also accession the toxicology evidence. And so as Peter was mentioning with the accessioning process, this is the group that opens that kit, ensures that everything is correct, and then gets those tubes ready for toxicology to then analyze. So during COVID, this section, except for 1 month, has only been on site at 50% capacity. And as you can imagine from the work I just described, this is not work that can be done from home. You can't go pick up evidence from home. So I really just want to point out how great they've done. We've only seen, as you can see on the graph, that is the amount of items that were transferred last year in green during this window, which is April to July, compared to this year. So there's been about a 17% decrease in the amount of items we've been taking back and forth. Some of that could be correlated to COVID. I think it's also difficult because, every year we see something a little bit different, but they've been able to keep up with exactly what the lab needs with 50% staff, even though we've only seen that 17% reduction. The other piece is they've been able to manage staying at or under a 3-day turnaround time for the toxicology accessioning throughout the pandemic. And that's also really important because you don't want that accessioning process to hold up the testing that's being done in toxicology. So it's kind of an update on where they're at. And you might get sick of this as I go through this slide, but really a shout out to the staff because it's really impressive the amount of work that they've continued to get done throughout the stress of this pandemic and just the lack of staff on site during this pandemic. Does anybody have any questions?
No, I think it's great that they've been able to do what they've been able to do under the circumstances. So yes, they are definitely should be commended on that.
Thank you. I will let them know. So the next section is seized drugs. This is another section that has been other than 1 month, because there was 1 month in the middle of this where we thought we could bring people back and quickly realized we couldn't. So they've been at 50% capacity other than that 1 month. This is also a section that currently we cannot do the casework from home. Even the report writing, it is something that we're working on. Right now, we're in meetings with, the first step is with the vendor of the instrumentation. We're in meetings with them to figure out how to get that information in a way we can see it digitally, which would then lead to the next steps to have them be able to do review work remotely. That being said, currently they cannot. What we have seen in this section, unlike some of the others, is a significant decrease in the amount of requests coming in the door. And so that has allowed us to keep up with the work, even though we're at 50% capacity. And so as you can see, the green bar is the number of requests that are coming in during the time frame of April to July this year. The orange bar is how many requests we've completed. So as you can see, with the reduced number of requests, we've kept up with what's coming in the door. They've kept up with that at about a 14-day turnaround time, which is an increase. Our normal turnaround time in that section is anywhere from like 8 to 10 days. So we have seen that increase in the turnaround time, but still manageable for the system. The other piece on this section to update y'all on is, as they've been dealing with COVID, they've also been dealing with House Bill 1325, which came about a year ago, which I'm sure we've had several conversations in the board meeting about that, which basically it legalized hemp. And so the problem for labs is the definition of hemp has to do with the amount of THC in the sample. When that bill passed, we did not have, nor did any other labs have the capacity to do that quantitation. So to be able to take a plant sample and say how much THC was in the sample. And so this has been a big challenge. So over the last year, our section has also been working with the county lab as well as DPS to collaboratively come up with a testing method to deal with this problem. So the testing method we came up with is actually semi-quantitative. And what that means is the law says that if it's at or above 0.3%, that is what's dictating whether it's marijuana or hemp. We right now can't go down that low to 0.3%. What we were able to come up with is a method that will detect whether it's above or below 1%. And so that's why we're calling it semi-quantitative. The advantage of bringing this method online is for plant material. Most of the time, if it is marijuana, you're looking at 3% content or above. So it's going to help identify the true marijuana plant cases. The other advantage was we have the equipment to do this, as do the other labs. So it isn't something where we had to have a large financial contribution in order to bring this testing online. The plan right now is for this method to come online at the end of this month. Because it was developed with instrumentation that we already have, we were able to bring 3 instruments online to do this testing. And right now, in the whole year that we've been developing this, we've accumulated 15 cases that we need to do this testing on out of all the cases that we've gotten. And so currently, we're not thinking that there's going to be a big impact to capacity with bringing this online. That being said, that is it's new, and there may be a different reaction when we can do the testing versus the testing is coming. And so we'll certainly keep y'all posted if, as we go online with this at the end of this month, if we start seeing capacity issues in the section. And the other piece to this to remember is this is only for plant material. They are still working on how to develop this method more towards being able to do like vaping oils, edibles, those kinds of things. But right now, this is just for plant material.
Dr. Castillo, I believe Director Blanset has a question.
Okay.
So my question is, first as an observation, if you're looking at plant material and you're looking at 1% THC or more in the results, that basically says that you're going to have some false negatives, because anything less than 1% could still be THC if it's above 0.3%, according to the law. Is that correct?
That is correct. And we do need to be prepared to find some, if it needs to be more definitive than that. If it needs to be, is it above 0.3 but below 1? We have identified an outsourcing lab that we can use to get that testing done. So we have kind of that backup plan. It's not cheap, so we'd like to not use that backup plan if we have to, but this will get us started.
Okay. And since it's plant material only, are there any other means of helping detect a marijuana plant versus a hemp plant through botany, saying this is a plant that is one or the other?
I'm going to have James answer that question because I've never done this analysis. That being said, I think part of the challenge is it's that THC content more than the botany that is telling us based on this law whether it's hemp or marijuana. But I can certainly get with James to get you a more detailed answer on that. I don't want to say the wrong thing given this definitely is not my specialty.
Okay, because what I'm hearing here is it sounds like you've developed a sorting routine that you can sort out things that are definitely THC material, but things that are not, you're not quite sure about yet.
And I was that statement, right? It's
So, Amy,
yes.
I think I can
Okay.
I can help a little bit here. So, yeah, hemp and marijuana. I will constrain my rant. What the legal definition changed, this was the Federal Farm Act that changed this to say marijuana is cannabis sativa L, all plant parts and derivatives, extracts, various parts of that contains more than 0.3% delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol by dry weight. So hemp and marijuana are the same plant. It's all in the horticulture of how it is grown. There are varieties that grow more stalk and more low THC plant material known as hemp. And there are varieties that grow more flower and high THC containing materials called marijuana. So the legal definition has become a purely chemical differentiation around one cannabinoid, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, of 109 different cannabinoids that are in the plant. And it's that determination in comparison to the dry weight of the plant. That is the determinant between marijuana and hemp. It's perfect. You know, it all looks, smells the same, except for that delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol.
So I think the answer then is you can't use botany to do a further differentiation. Nope. You really have to go with a more expensive test of a hopefully smaller sample set of evidence.
This created the whole problem to begin with, because what laboratories used to do prior to the Federal Farm Act and then subsequently the state laws allowing for industrial hemp production is we would do a morphological examination of the plant, the botany that you're suggesting. We look for these glandular structures on the leaves that are very characteristic of cannabis species plants. So that gives us cannabis sativa. Then we did a color spot test called the modified Duquesnoy-Levine test that turns purple in the presence of cannabinoids. And it's relatively specific to cannabinoids, but it is not specific to delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. So it will turn purple with CBD, which in hemp, CBD, cannabidiol, is much more prevalent in hemp than THC. It's part of the reason they grow hemp. It'll turn purple with it. So I can tell you it's cannabis sativa L with cannabinoids, but I can't tell you whether it is hemp or marijuana. So when they changed to a quantitative limit, a cutoff, that test was no longer sufficient to be able to do it, and none of the laboratories were in a position to actually have that quantitative determination. It has created chaos all across the country.
Okay. So based on what we know already that's in the lab, what percent of evidence that is plant material do you think will end up having to go to a more expensive test to be able to determine the 0.3%?
Good news for us, this has less impact for us than it does for other places in the state, because Harris County, long prior to this stuff, was not prosecuting, wasn't pursuing those personal quantities of marijuana. They basically dump it out, give somebody a scolding, and send them on their way. So we don't have these small quantity cases, which are the real problem, or could be the really difficult thing to try and sort out, those misdemeanor quantities. Some of the evidence that I've seen out of, excuse me, commercial laboratories, the one commercial laboratory, NMS, they've done about 2,500 cases nationwide. Very few, like less than 4% of the cases aren't clearly marijuana. 5 to 20% THC, not even a question. Very few of them fall in this kind of low category. Maybe they're hemp. So out of this, probably, and you can see it, even across the year that we've been unable to actually identify marijuana, we've accumulated 15 cases. I don't think this is going to be very many. And so that's also part of the reason why statewide, everybody's been concerned about not sinking money into much more expensive equipment to do this quantitation, because we have no idea really how many cases it's going to be. There's some suggestion it's not going to be very many. And then next legislative session, things could change and make a $250,000 investment moot. So that was the intent, was to design testing around existing equipment that gets a good enough answer until we understand better.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on this? Okay, so the next section we'll talk about is blood alcohol and toxicology. Like we mentioned, we're going to go into a lot more detail in this section next month. That being said, as far as a pandemic update, they are also a section, all of our sections for the most part are 50% capacity on site. However, they have been able to figure out a way to do a lot of their report writing and review from home. So when they're on site, they're focusing on the lab work, and then on their off week when they're at home, they're focusing on report writing and review. And as you can see, the green bar is the number of requests that we were completing last year in the same time frame. Compared to the orange bar, there has been a significant increase in the amount of requests that are being completed in that section. Some of this is attributable to the 2 new analysts that we've gotten signed off. And something to point out, whenever analysts are in training, it's also pulling other analysts off of casework to some extent. And so when we get 2 analysts signed off, it also means we get some more of our analysts on casework full time again. So that has definitely had an impact. The other piece is, as the new budget was released, we are able to outsource some of our drug confirmations until we bring our new instrumentation online. And so that process has been moving very efficiently, which has helped get more of these requests done. And we are seeing decreases in the backlogs in this section. Then, like I said, next month is when Dr. Lee, the manager of that section, will go into depth of the 3-year plan in that section that has to do with bringing these new positions online, getting rid of the backlogs, and bringing the new instrumentation and the new drug methods online. Okay, and then we have our firearms section. So our firearms section has 2 different functions. They have the firearms examination section, and then we have our NIBIN team, which is the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. The best way to describe this is like CODIS for firearms, where they're entering images into a database to see if it hits against other casings that have been put into the database to help give leads on shootings and crimes. So for this division, the firearms examiners did split into 2 teams. They rotate 1 week on site and 1 week off site. They are able to do some casework for firearms off site. They also have been able to do a lot of the technical review for the NIBIN work. The NIBIN technicians, a lot of what they do is test fire weapons, which clearly cannot be done from home. So they were not divided into teams. We have 3 technicians. They are on site daily. Thankfully, with our new facility, we're able to keep them, not on top of each other when they're doing their work. So as this has been going on, our NIBIN turnaround time during this time has had an average turnaround time of 38 hours. Our goal is 48 hours. So they have been knocking that out of the park with the work that they've been doing there. The firearms exams, we mentioned a couple months ago, we're keeping a close eye on that. What we see is that we're able to keep up with the number of requests that are coming in the door, which you can see from the green bar and the orange bar. The green is what we've received, the orange is what we've completed each month. So we are keeping up quantity-wise. But what we were concerned with is the uptick in turnaround time. We have drawn a line in the sand of 60 days to where we would say we have to change some things of how we're handling the pandemic when we get to that point. While we're not at 60 days, we have seen in the past 3 months an uptick. And so this section is currently working on looking at that process and trying to figure out what more of the firearms exam work can be done from home, or do we need to potentially bring somebody back on site to do some of the more of that exam work so that we don't get past 60 days on that turnaround time. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, so I'm going to move on to our backlog updates. So one backlog we have been talking about quite a bit in the past few months is our sexual assault kit backlog. This is just a picture of where we were at the end of the month. The biggest place that we were able to make progress last month was in the outsource reviews. And just as a reminder, that is the process that happens when we get a report back from a vendor laboratory. Our analysts, a fully qualified DNA analyst, has to review all of that data and it basically technically review that data before we can put that profile into CODIS. And so they have been able to focus on that a lot in the past month, as they have through the pandemic. If you remember last month, that number was at 511. We're now at 291. So they have made significant progress in those outsource reviews. The other piece on this is we did ship our first shipments based on the contracts that y'all approved last month. We shipped 363 kits to 2 vendors. We shipped 210 to the vendor in Austin and 153 to the vendor that's in Virginia. The great news from the vendor in Austin is what they're going to do is pull the 30 oldest kits out of the 210 and have those back within 60 days. The rest of those 210 they're going to have back within 120 days. And then everything we send them, our plan is to send them kits every month now, what's coming in the door. They will have those back to us within 60 days. It was just that first bulk that we sent them that was the 120 days. And then Bodie, we are still, which is the vendor in Virginia, we are still working on their timelines. They are the vendor who has had some capacity issues. However, they were the vendor that also allowed for us to get quite a bit of this work done within the federal budget that we had. And so they're working with us right now on when the kits are going to be coming back. And especially in the weekly data, I will make sure that that's getting updated as soon as we have information or as soon as we receive reports back from the vendor labs. The other thing to go through in the DNA backlog is what we're putting together as our projected timeline to clear the backlog. A couple things I want to point out on this. This is the entire in-house DNA backlog, not just kits. When we're trying to plan this in the section, it's always very challenging to try to figure out how to just prioritize kits over the other work that comes in the door. I think, as Peter has said in the past, is how do you choose to prioritize one heinous crime over another? And so when we're coming up with this timeline for the backlog elimination, the goal was to come up with a plan for all of it. this is the in-house work. To come up with a timeline for the outsource work is a little difficult when we have one vendor who isn't giving us exact timelines for kits to come back. And so what I want to let you know is that monthly, I will update this timeline, our progress against it for the operations report. But weekly, I'm going to include a graph that looks somewhat similar that is more about all the entire backlog. So that will include the in-house backlog for kits and non-kits, as well as the outsource work, and what we have waiting for CODIS review. So you'll see two different things in the weekly update versus the ops report. But of course, you know, anytime any of y'all have any questions, just reach out to me. It's a lot of data, and trying to fit it on one graph can get almost more confusing than doing something different. So I'm always happy to answer questions. So for the timeline, one thing I'm going to throw out there is, you know, the section worked really hard on this timeline, trying to take everything into account, that we're in a pandemic, that we're bringing on a new technology, that we have analysts at varying stages of experience. None of us are thrilled with how long this timeline goes out. As you can see, for the in-house backlog, we're looking at November of next year before we're totally done with the in-house. That being said, we're really trying to make sure that we are taking everything into account that we can, given typically I feel like our history has been we've set pretty aggressive deadlines for ourselves, and then they're hard to meet. So we want something that is realistic for the staff to be able to meet and for us to be able to hit these targets. So a couple of the highlights along this timeline is in January of 2021 is when we anticipate all of the analysts that are signed off currently to be at what we're going to say is full capacity with StarMix. So it's giving some ramp up time for the expectations of kits complete or cases completed by analysts between now and January. So we have some more experienced analysts that are already at 15 requests a month, right? And we're going to build in that will increase between now and January. And then we have our really newly signed off analysts that we actually only have at 8 requests a month right now because of everything we've talked about in the past with they're new to it. Their cases have to be technically reviewed by a supervisor. It's just not as efficient of a process. But we have by January them being at 15 requests per month. And so this timeline is taking that into account. The other piece is in April of 2021 is when we estimate that all of any in-house kits, sexual assault kits that we have will be completed. And so the rest of that timeline is dealing with the non-SAK portion of the backlog. We also, and we will talk more about this in October when we go into details on the training plan, we have 4 new analysts or 4 examiners that are going to start analyst training in October. And so based on the new timeline, we're projecting that we would get them signed off in August of 2021, which also then adds not a ton of capacity because they're going to be at those 8 cases a month, but it's still some capacity to clearing the backlog. The other piece that's really important and why this goes out past when the in-house backlog is gone is the outsourcing. Our plan right now is we have federal funds to be able to utilize outsourcing during this entire time to help us clear the backlog. It is a really important tool for us right now to be able to get these requests done and out the door. That being said, if our last shipment is in November of 2021, we're building in some time so that it's clear we will still have those backlogged until we get them back and entered into CODIS. And so that's why the timeline actually ends in February of 2022. Our plan is to update this every month to let y'all know both where we're at on the backlog compared to what we're projecting, and also the green bars at the bottom are what we're projecting we should be completing. And so we'll also update that. Our intent is that this is really going to help us know very quickly if we're on track or not, and how we need to make adjustments to get back on track, or because we are dealing with a lot of unknowns in this timeline, adjust the timeline accordingly, but make sure that everybody is aware of where we're at on that timeline. Does anybody have any questions about this? Okay, So the next backlog we're going to talk about, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about it, and then you're going to hear quite a bit from Tim and Amy about the latent prints backlog. So we've been struggling with this backlog for quite some time. And as you can see, this timeline actually goes back all the way to 2017, which the backlog started prior to then. Tim will go into more details on that. But as you can see, in 2017, starting in 17 and through 2018, we were actually making significant progress on that backlog. And then we ran into some more challenges in the section, which Tim will talk about. And you can see from then until now, we've seen an increase in the backlog. We are seeing we're kind of at hopefully a plateau of where that backlog is at right now. That being said, without trying to mitigate for that, we don't have a solution for bringing it back down, which is clearly the goal. It's not great for anybody that these cases are sitting waiting to be worked. And so that's where Amy is going to come in. She's going to talk about our plans for a Lean Six Sigma project to try to help find some efficiencies in the section without necessarily getting new staff, because at this point in time, we know that we don't have the budget for more staff in this section. So the next two presentations will go into more detail on this one. And that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions about this or any of the other slides I covered?
All right, thank you, Dr. Castillo. All right, so our next item, we're going to move on to item number 8, which is our presentation from Mr. Tim Schmall, who's the manager of Latent Prints. He will provide us a brief overview of the latent print backlog and the challenges presented by having more evidence items in each case. So I will, let's see, it is all yours, Mr. Schmall.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. And can everybody see my screen now? No. I have
Yes.
trouble with Teams sometimes. Good morning. My name is Tim Schmall. I'm the manager of the Latent Print section at the Houston Print Science Center. If you remember, February's board directors meeting presented kind of a timeline of events that occurred from when we first built the latent print section. Some ups and downs that we faced over time, most notably the almost overnight increase of about 2,400 cases that were sent to us because HPD found 2,400 cases in their property room that were never sent to us. We put a plan in place. It took a few years to mitigate that, but as you can see in this graph, and starting in January of 2018, everything that we put in place started to come together. I'm trying to do fancy stuff like Peter does. So if you can see here, starting in January, all the way up through to about end of May, our clearance rate was constantly going up. And so basically we were eating into that backlog as the previous slide that Amy had showed. And it was significantly going down, much so that I was anticipating to have the backlog wiped out by the end of the year. December 2018, we would have a 0 backlog and we would be caught up. So somewhere around June, it started declining. Down about here. And so once I started really digging into it, I realized that our newly civilianized crime scene unit had gotten really, really good at lifting more and more latent print evidence out of crime scenes. So the number of cases being submitted didn't dramatically increase. It was the contents inside those evidence envelopes that actually increased. And so with more latent lift evidence within the cases, increases in actually usable latent prints increased as well. This graph here kind of shows lift cards versus requests. They were increasing, and suitable prints per request, they were also increasing. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. And here in this photograph, I show the difference in the size of a typical case that we used to get from old HPD cases on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, this is a crime scene unit case that was submitted to us. Actually, we have quite a number of these within our vault. Most of them come out of the vehicle examination bay, the VEB. You can get lots and lots of fingerprints off of a vehicle. So that case right there has 77 lift cards in it. That doesn't mean that of those 77 lift cards that there's one print on each lift card. It's not. It can contain many, many different prints on there. So our current strategy, as outlined in February, we had our latent print apprentices. They were offsite at a training facility. They have since returned from being offsite for 5 months. They returned in March. We tested them out of each module of our latent print examiner training program. 3 of the trainees began supervised casework in June. And full independent casework authorizations, they're expected by January 2021. The 4th trainee is almost ready to enter into his dependent supervised casework. And that's where basically in that phase, that's where they have tested out of everything. We're confident that they are a latent print examiner. They have the skill set to actually start training on working cases. They're paired with another latent print examiner where they work the case alongside their primary trainer to learn the system, learn our workflows. And at the end of their training, basically the main trainer basically states that they can work a case from start to finish with minimal or no errors. So. Okay. All right. I decided to kind of throw in kind of a quick lesson of why a latent print case can take so long, because I think most people don't really know what goes on in the latent print examination process, and what they see from TV, such shows as like CSU, Las Vegas, Miami, all that stuff. It's very dramatic and it's kind of misrepresented. So, as I stated before, the number of latent prints within a package, it can vary, but it has increased, and it varies from case to case. So, to start with, the examiner has to inventory all those contents. They have to label each latent lift card. I think the largest case that I've seen in our vault right now, I think the record was 144 latent lift cards. Unknown how many actual usable prints have come out of that yet. I think it hasn't been worked yet. So the examiner then has to analyze each one of those cards to determine are there any suitable latent prints of value they can use for comparison purposes. So after suitability is determined, a second examiner has to verify that. So the entire package goes to a second examiner, and they apply the same methods to either refute or agree with the first examiner's conclusions. So let's take, this is an example of a latent lift card. This is an actual case that was just released, cut off all the identifiers. But to the average person just looking at this, it looks like a bunch of smudges probably. But in actuality, the examiner has identified all of these as separate latent prints contained on one latent lift card. So there's 16 different touches from various parts of the friction ridges from the hands or the palms contained on this card. And an examiner, that's just one card. They had to physically examine each one of these to determine if they were suitable or not, and correct orientation. So that's not good. Sorry about that. So each latent print is deemed suitable for comparison is searched in multiple databases, automated fingerprint identification systems. Now the database, it generates candidates basically, and they have to manually be compared by an examiner. So contrary, like I said, with CSU on TV and shows like that, the computer database, it doesn't compare any prints. It doesn't make matches. It's just a tool. It generates a candidate list of what it thinks may be a match, and that's a mathematical algorithm that's above my head that it's extracting information from the latent versus the hundreds of thousands of temperate cards that are in these databases. So this is an example of a APHIS generated candidate list. On the left-hand side, you see that's a latent print. I know it looks like probably a bunch of lines, but there's actually usable information in there for an examiner. And on the right-hand side, the APHIS machine, this system said that, hey, I think this may be a good candidate. Well, the person missing a finger, so it can't be that finger. So that's just how, the system is just a tool, basically. It's not infallible. On this next one, next screen capture, on the left-hand side, you have the latent print. On the right-hand side, that's the image of the record print that the computer thinks that, hey, this may be a good candidate once the examiner compare it. You can see you see the ridge lines are kind of sloping to the left, and on the right-hand side, they're sloping to the right. Obviously, that is not going to be a match. Here's an actual picture of, this was an actual APHIS association, or a hit as we call it. On the left-hand side, this is the latent print. You can see that's typical of the latent prints that we're generally working with, or examiner is. They're highly distorted. They have to extract information out of the second level characteristics, as we call them. And on the right-hand side, so they've actually marked this up to say, hey, these features are in agreement, so this is actually an APHIS association. So once the examiner finishes all that and writes up their final report, case notes are done. The case is technically administratively reviewed by reviewer to make sure it's accurate. The work matches with the final report, and before it's released. So back to this case. Remember I said, we could have a package that's really small, but you see on that one card that there were 16 latent prints of value just on that one latent lift card. So in this particular case, it only had 11 latent lift cards. It seems like a small case to work, but once you got into it, they identified 47 suitable latent prints within those 11 lifts. And so once they searched it through the APHIS databases, 6 different individuals were preliminary associated. So it was assigned May 22nd. Of this year, and the case was completed July 14th. So that's just how long and time intensive that the process takes. And so when we have at last over 2,400 cases pending in our backlog of various sizes, you can see just the time and the time it takes and the effort it takes with the examiners to get that done. So all in all, the stakeholder benefits from more information, more people being identified, but our process is taking longer. So as such, our Lean Six Sigma project is going to be starting in October, and we're going to examine the processes and determine our resource needs that we're going to need. Because as Peter stated before, he knows that CSU is woefully understaffed for a city this size, and as CSU grows, we're going to have to grow too, but we just don't know at this point how many more latent print examiners we'll need in relation to CSU officers. And I think that is the end of my piece. I apologize if I spoke fast. Anybody have any questions?
Okay, it doesn't look like it. Mr. Small, I do want to say thank you for your service to HFSC. Mr. Small has accepted a position with the United States Postal Service. From what I understand, I learned something new. They have their own crime lab, which is cool. And that when you make it to, if you're at the Postal Service, then you're like at the mecca of latent prints. I mean, it is, it's at the top of the field. And I want to say congratulations on that position. We will definitely miss you. I also want to congratulate you on all the work that you have done with the latent print section. I mean, you have reorganized it, and you have a plan to move forward. And we will have to keep in touch to let you know how this plan that you've set in motion continues to move forward. And just thank you so much for everything that you've done for HFSC and the community.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I definitely look forward to keeping tabs on my latent print family, as I call it here, because they're a great bunch of people, and they're going to continue to do great things. So.
Yes, and no poaching, just saying. Okay.
Can't guarantee anything.
So, thank you so much. Okay, as part 2 of this presentation, we have Ms. Amy Grimaldi, and she will provide an overview of a planned Lean Six Sigma project, the project's risk timelines, team selection process, the goals, and will give us a nice overview of that. Ms. Grimaldi, I am going to turn it over to you now.
Okay, great. Good morning. I'm Amy Grimaldi, a project engineer in our Lean Six Sigma development group. I'll just stop here. Can you all hear me and see my slides okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so as Tim mentioned, we're gearing up for a Lean Six Sigma project in the Light and Print section. And so today I'll give you an overview of what that project will look like, the timeline that we're expecting, and some of the challenges that we'll face. So before we dive into the specifics of the Light and Print project, I wanted to share with you a little bit about how projects are selected. So first, the staff member submits a project idea, and then the Lean Six Sigma team evaluates the project. And we looked at factors such as how long it would take to complete that project. And then we also look at factors for impact. We want to know how much impact this project would have on the company. So we estimate the size of the project, meaning how much of the company would be impacted. We look at cost savings. We also evaluate if there are any quality risks at the moment. And then we evaluate how our stakeholders would prioritize this project. So would our internal staff prioritize this project as a high need, and how would even our external stakeholders prioritize this project? And then after we rate its impact, we always want to start with the project that's going to have the highest impact. So the next thing we have to look at is what disruptions are going on in the project area at the time. So for example, the LIMS implementation and the lab and the staff moves were very disruptive processes that were going on that would have impact our project if we decided to start a section specific one at that time. And so now that those are over, we're in a better position to start this section specific process in the Light and Print section. And so I should mention, while COVID definitely is disruptive, the process has remained the same for several months now. And so that's why we're starting to gear up, and we're ready to start this project in October. So Tim's mentioned some of the challenges the section has faced. So what this project is intended to do is to do a deep dive into the processes to determine where we can gain efficiency. The ultimate goal will be to reduce backlog and decrease our turnaround time, but it's really important that the quality of the work cannot be compromised due to any of these process changes. Another major objective that we'll be looking at, Tim kind of mentioned, was that we need to develop a staffing projection model to predict our future needs. So we need to determine if and when the Light and Print section would need to expand as our crime scene unit expands, or if our item requests were to increase. And every project has several challenges that we'll face. The first one being the project team time. We're doing a section-specific project, meaning that we'll need about 30% of the Light and Print section to participate on the project team. And while they're participating on the team, we ask that they dedicate about 10 to 20% of their time a week on the team. On top of that, there are tools that the entire section will need to participate in. So for that reason, we estimate that production or the cases completed per month will be impacted during the initial phases of this project. We'll also have to learn the virtual world. This is a great example. Most of our tools are hands-on, in-person heavy, where we use lots of Post-its and that sort of thing. So it's no deal breaker. We just need to be a little creative in how we can drive engagement and still perform the tools in the virtual world. And then finally, we need to collaborate with our stakeholders. And so talking about time, they're just as busy as we are, especially during these times, but we'll need to evaluate all of our inputs into the process. So we definitely will be looking at where we can gain efficiencies in our internal process, but we also need to branch out even further. So we need to look at what supplies the inputs to the process. The three main inputs for stakeholders to this process would be our crime scene unit, the HPD investigative divisions, and also the property room. So we'll need to be highly collaborative with all of those stakeholders to ensure that the solution that we design also works for them as well. Next thing we do is select the team. Right now it's time to configure the dream team, and it's carefully crafted by all of these categories here. So first, we do have a representative of executive management as our project champion. They ensure that the teamwork is in line with our company goals. We should have subject matter experts on our team, and then we'd also importantly have our analysts and section management on the team. But then we also look for support staff. Again, we have to look at our inputs and suppliers into this project, and our client services, case management, the quality division, and our R&D departments are all major players in their process. And then finally, it's important that we expand the team to include people from other sections, perhaps some people who can give perspective on the process. So for this project, some sections that come to mind first would be the firearms unit. It's another comparative division, so perhaps they can give perspective on their process and how they perform things and how Layton performs things. Another unit would be the crime scene unit, right? We talked about they're a major supplier there. And then, you know, we may go as far as to say, you know, well, let's look at somebody from the forensic biology unit because they, you know, or well, they have a database, and let's compare how they use that database to how it may impact Layton Prints. So again, you can see how many people it takes to really get a team together that can provide constructive, you know, criticism and feedback and brainstorming, all while we're meeting for our project time. So then finally, I wanted to estimate a timeline for you. So we're estimating that this is a larger project. We're estimating that it's going to be about 6 to 8 months. This is your classic Lean Six Sigma project. Has 5 phases, and it's defined as a waterfall style project. So that means that our champion has to approve whether or not we can move to the next phase or not. We have to present our project work, and then they determine if we can move to the next phase. So I estimate that for the rest of this year, we'll be in the first 2 phases, right? We're going to be talking with our stakeholders, learning more about the challenges that we have internally as well as externally. We'll have to, you know, start measuring the process. We're going to be doing a lot of data collection, a lot of task time analysis there. But I think we'll spend the majority of our time in our analyze and improve phase. And that's because when we get to that 3rd phase, we're actually identifying improvements that we can make. And then when we get to improve, we'll actually be launching the new process. And so you can see how those 2 phases are really important. They take more time, and we'll need to be highly collaborative with all of our stakeholders there. So when all said and done, we look to be completely done with the project by next summer. And that's actually all I have for you today. Would anyone have any questions about the project overview?
Okay, does anyone have any questions or comments for Ms. Grimaldi or Mr. Schmall related to all this latent print information we've gotten? Okay, thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing the results of the Lean Six Sigma project. Thank you, Ms. Grimaldi. Okay, our next agenda item is item number 9, a report from Mr. Jerry Pena, who is the Director of CSU and Digital Multimedia Evidence sections. He is going to talk about the significant spike in homicides in July and planned renovations at the Vehicle Examination Building. Mr. Pena, I will give you the floor.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Let me get my PowerPoint here, and hopefully y'all can see this. I'm pretty efficient at this. Can y'all see that?
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
And I need to, I had it queued earlier, sorry. Okay, here we go. So Jerry Pena, Director of Crime Scene Multimedia, good morning. So going to give you a quick overview of the stats as they stand now with the section and where we're at nationwide. We start off with comparative analysis between last year, this time period, and this year. As you can see, there's been a in total call volume for the crime scene unit just in the month of July. It's increased from 63 to 69 calls. Moving on to homicides, where we see a significant increase. Last year at the same time, July of last year compared to July of this year, we've gone from 13 to 29. And that's pretty consistent with what the nation is seeing. At least the top 10 cities in the nation are all pretty much seeing increases across the board. As far as aggravated assaults, again, last year we answered 15 in the month of July versus 20 in the month of July this year. And the difference is, I think HPD and Major Assault Unit are getting more comfortable using the crime scene section as a main tool for proper documentation and evidence collection. They're getting real comfortable with that, and we're seeing I'm not so sure that the aggravated assaults themselves are going up in the city, but definitely the need for service from the crime scene unit is going up to handle some of those aggravated assaults. And we're seeing an uptick month after month on that. Again, with vehicle examinations, Tim Schmall alluded to the fact earlier about most of the prints that his section receives are from the crime scene unit that are in direct processing of vehicles at the vehicle examination building. And you can see last year 43 compared to 52 this year just in the month of July. So that's an area where we've increased as well, and we're seeing more and more activity at the VEB. And the VEB is an area where it's not crime specific, whereas the crime scene unit usually responds to major calls such as homicides, aggravated assaults, officer involved shootings, baby deaths, and so on. The VEB could be a wide range of offenses that those vehicles are involved in, anywhere from a purse snatching all the way up to a homicide or an officer involved shooting. So the vehicles that do get processed there, require forensic examination. Usually have latent prints, blood, stuff like that. So it's important that, and I'll touch base more in my presentation about the process at the VEB. But we're definitely seeing an increase in vehicles being taken to the VEB for forensic processing. Any questions on that so far? Okay. I alluded to earlier the crime stats nationwide, and these stats are compiled from the Chicago Police Department, and they're kind of like a clearinghouse that track the 10 largest cities in the country, Houston being one of them. And you can see where Houston is number 4 as far as percentage increase this year compared to last year, just homicides alone. So last year we had 140 homicides from January through July compared to this year where it's 197. That's a 41% increase. And in looking at those numbers, we're on pace to reach about 337 homicides for this year, 2020. We are currently sitting at, year to date, we're sitting at 210 murders, homicides. And compared to last year in July, we had 25 homicides, and already we're up to 13 this year, the month of July, August, I'm sorry, I'm talking about August. So we're definitely starting to see an increase in murders, and we're on pace this month to beat last year's totals for the month of August. Questions on that? And I can't see if anybody raised their hand the way I have my screen set up. So if there are, please interrupt me. Okay, we'll move on. Back to the vehicle examination building and the operational use of that facility. Everybody's aware of how the VEB is undergoing a renovation. We started off with the big picture and we outlined everything that we would need that facility to have in order to be compliant with our accreditation standards, as well as taking into account the processing that does occur in that facility. To do it right, we determined that we were going to have to replace the flooring, or at least add to the flooring to where we could easily decontaminate the floors, redesigning the office area, new perimeter fencing to include paving the front area of the VEB where cars are brought in by the wreckers. Because of the budget being as small as it is, we had 152 to 152,000 to work with, so that allowed us to replace the air conditioning system, which was old and antiquated. It's just the air conditioning system there leaked, and the condensation built up and would drip onto the floor and onto vehicles that were parked right underneath it. So it's not a good situation if you're trying to preserve evidence. Enclosing the open bays, which we have 4 bays that are enclosed and climate controlled, and we have 4 that are semi-closed but that are open to the elements. So closing those in and creating a complete 8-bay climate controlled facility would be ideal with the influx of cars that we're taking in. And then lastly, we have enough to renovate the bathroom, which during Hurricane Harvey was completely destroyed. They did some minor repairs to it, but it was nowhere near where it should be for staff to feel comfortable using the facilities there when they spend all day there. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay. So as I said, replacing the air conditioning and closing the bays and working on the bathroom, that was a priority set by the team working on it, and that's based on the funds available. My next slide, I'll show where HPD is assisting with the project and has agreed to work with security upgrades, badge access to the Dart Street vehicle gate, and possibly they're going to be able to help with lighting inside and out of the VEB. And that's where we're currently at. I believe renovation is scheduled to start within the next couple of weeks, and it's projected to be fully completed by the end of October. And that is my report. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Pena. Okay, item number 10 is our report from Ms. Erica Zemak, our quality director, and she's going to talk about quality assurance, a review of the blind quality control program, testimony monitoring, stakeholder survey, and proficiency testing. Ms. Zemak.
Good morning, how are you? My first slide, as usual, is the graphical representation of the blind quality controls submitted within the month of July. And as you can see, the quality division has met all of their submission goals for that month. For accomplishments and challenges, Dr. Stout and myself have been invited to give a blind program presentation at the virtual Southwestern Association of Forensic Scientists, or SWAFS conference. The presentation is slated to be 2 hours long, and perhaps in some view, Dr. Stout and I speaking for 2 hours might not be that exciting, but Dr. Stout and I are very excited about it, especially in this day and age with everything going on right now with COVID, the uncertainty of annual conferences and professional meetings. And so we were honored to be asked to present. And speaking of the uncertainty of forensic conferences, the Annual Association of Firearm and Tool Marks Examiners, or the AFD conference, was officially canceled about 2 weeks ago. And if you recall, there were representatives from the quality division that were slated to participate in a blind workshop that we were going to be given, specially geared towards helping laboratories implement a blind program at their laboratory. And so we are disappointed, of course, that that conference was canceled. It was originally scheduled to take place in May. It was then postponed to October and now has been officially canceled. But we are hopeful that in a future conference, the blind workshop will be included on an upcoming agenda. Are there any questions that I can answer about the blind program or either of those presentations? Okay. For internal audits and assessments, we had our external assessment in the month of July and no nonconformances were found. There were a total of 46 standards and requirements assessed. So let me just give you a little bit of background information to put that in perspective. HFSC is accredited to the ISO standard 17025, and that standard is a general standard for testing and calibration laboratories. It by no means is specific to forensic laboratories. In addition to the ISO standard, our accrediting body, ANAB, has supplemental requirements that are very much geared solely for forensic laboratories. And so all told, those two documents together sum up to 203 standards or requirements that we are in compliance with in order to be an accredited laboratory. And so this particular assessment that took place was not an assessment to all 203 of those standards or requirements, but rather it's a surveillance assessment. So there's a sampling of standards and requirements that we are assessed to, 46 in total. And again, as I said, there were no nonconformances found during that assessment. If you recall, this was HFSC's first remote virtual assessment. And so that was something that took a little bit of flexibility in order to make it through, essentially, if you will. But the lead assessor was able to review documents remotely. She was able to interview staff members over the phone. And she was also able to observe some laboratory activities utilizing FaceTime. So she was able to accomplish everything that she needed to be able to accomplish to come to a conclusion about our continued compliance. Is there a question or? No, okay, sorry, I heard a noise and I wasn't sure what that indicated. Overall, in the closing meeting, the lead assessor was very complimentary to HFSC. She went out of her way to compliment our eDiscovery site. She also complimented our thorough root cause analysis and our commitment to transparency. And so overall, it was a very positive experience for HFSC. But that being said, that assessment is now behind us and we are already gearing up and ready for our next assessment, which is scheduled to take place this October. So this October will be an on-site assessment, meaning at a minimum, the lead assessor will be physically coming to HFSC. And of course, we will take all precautions necessary to ensure not only her safety, but the safety of our staff. This assessment is specifically for the forensic biology section. So in addition to not only the ISO standard and the ANAB supplemental requirements that I just spoke about, the forensic biology section has an added layer of compliance to the FBI quality assurance standards. And it's only through a continued demonstration of compliance to these standards that we are able to have access to the CODIS database. So as you can imagine, this is an extremely important assessment. And what's also important to note about this assessment is that it will be our first assessment to the July 2020 version of the QAS standards. So on July 1st, the new version of these standards became effective. And so again, this will be our first time having an external agency or an external body come in and measure our compliance to these standards. But the quality division and the forensic biology section have already been collaborating to ensure that assessment preparation begins. It's actually already begun. And although October will be here before you know it, we will be using all that time between now and then to ensure that we are ready to hit the ground running and again, have another successful positive assessment. Are there any questions that I can answer about our July assessment or even our upcoming October QAS assessment? Okay. And so this month, I wanted to share with the board a recent quality initiative that the quality division underwent. So stakeholder feedback is, or seeking stakeholder feedback is not only an accreditation requirement, but it's also a fantastic quality tool. And so we have already had a survey available on our website for any of our stakeholders or anybody in the public to go on and give us feedback about our performance or the services that we provide. However, we took note of the fact that that survey had not been utilized. And so we went and took a look at the survey and we gave it an overhaul. We revamped it. We got it down to 4 questions and we tailored those 4 questions specifically to the information that we wanted to hear from our stakeholders. And in addition, not only do we have it available on our website, but we added a hyperlink to our email signature lines. And I have it right here, I've provided it to you. It says, help us improve. We would like to ask you a few questions about HFSC and our services. Please take this short survey. And so this was added to our email signature lines in February of 2020. And so far, as of July, we had received 25 responses. We actually just got another one earlier this week. So total right now we have 26. Of those responses, it was 16, it's now 17. The most recent survey was very satisfied. There have been 17 responses where the responder self-identifies as either satisfied or very satisfied. We've had 3 responses where they were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. And we've received 6 so far where the responder has self-identified as dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. And so 26 might not sound like a lot, but again, to put it in perspective, we've gotten 26 since February, and prior to that, we had 0. So all told, it has been a very successful initiative. So I've selected a couple of responses that I'd like to share with the board. Here is one from an investigator providing feedback on the forensic biology section. And this investigator is very satisfied and commented, I think HFSC does a great job. I can't think of anything to make it better, just my opinion. Here's another survey. This one is from a prosecutor, and this feedback is about the crime scene unit. This prosecutor was very satisfied and wrote, thanks for really good performance. Next one is from a defense attorney, and the feedback is about the toxicology section. This defense attorney was very satisfied and wrote, love the new discovery delivery via email, thank you. And so what this defense attorney is referring to is that previous to COVID, if a discovery request was received, all of the responsive documents for that request were gathered and then burned onto a disk, a CD, if you will. The requester then had to physically come to HFSC and pick up that CD. And so prior to COVID, it had been in the works, an electronic delivery as opposed to having to have a requester physically come to HFSC. But COVID sort of acted as a catalyst, if you will. And although the date of implementation was scheduled to be a bit further, all resources were put towards getting that implemented as soon as possible. And so the defense attorney in this response is letting us know that that new electronic discovery fulfillment system, if you will, has been a positive change. And so, of course, it wouldn't be an anonymous online survey if you didn't receive a response where it just kind of leaves you scratching your head. This particular survey response was from someone who was other member of the public outside of Houston. Their feedback was on the latent print section, and they said they were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, but their comment was too expensive. Why is it just because there is forensics involved? The classes are so expensive. It is a big ripoff. And pardon for the crass language on this last part, but it says, you are just sucking money from people who don't have enough sense to see it. Like I said, this is a bit of a head scratcher. When shared with the latent print section, we all agreed we did not know what this responder was referring to. They didn't leave their contact information, so there's no way to contact them and maybe get some clarity. Either way, though, like I said, this is the danger of an online survey. We knew that the risk was involved, but all told, I think the benefits of having this survey far outweigh, one survey response that leaves us scratching our head. Here's an example of a dissatisfied response. This one was from an investigator. It was for the forensic biology section. And again, as I said, this investigator was dissatisfied. And the comment is, I'm dissatisfied with the time it takes to complete the analysis of a sexual assault kit and confirmation of known buccal swabs. Several years ago, it was a 30-day process, and now it can be 180. Why? And so again, this responder didn't provide their contact information, and so it's not possible to answer the question directly to them. However, I would say we are continuously answering this question, and we're doing it in a public format. So for example, as you know, all of our metrics are posted on our website. They're available for the entire public to see. And these board meetings, right? Whenever we speak about board meetings, and again, this is a public meeting, we talk a lot about turnaround times and metrics, and we focus specifically on the biology section very often. And in addition, the biology section has had a very public attempt to try and reduce their turnaround time. As you know, they have an extensive cross-training program that they've already begun and are getting ready to continue, and also our outsourcing. We had a huge outsourcing project in 2018, and as Amy just said, we are now just geared up to start outsourcing again, actually have already started outsourcing again. And so while we're not in a position, like I said, to speak directly to this responder, I think we are speaking, more globally to the response. And the other thing I'd like to say is, while it's valid feedback, certainly, it's not new information, right? We were aware of this issue. We are already taking steps to try and mitigate this issue, but we do appreciate the feedback. And this is the last one I'm going to share with you. This was an investigator giving feedback on the latent print section. And this investigator said that they were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. However, the feedback that they gave was very significant. Our request for comparison was rejected due to duplicate requests. There are no directions or guidance and how I can view the outcome in order to follow up with charges. And so again, this requester didn't leave their exact contact information, but I would argue that this comment is so important that we gave a global response. And so what we did was sit down with the latent print section, and we took a look at their rejection process. So it turns out, in speaking with the latent print section, they have 3 main buckets for why a request would be rejected. And for those 3 buckets, we realized that there wasn't any standard language that was being given to the investigators when those rejections were being sent out. And so we sat down and crafted standard language for each one of these scenarios so that there was consistency now moving forward. So regardless of who was sending that rejection email, the same language was going to be used in that email, regardless of who it came from. We then went a step further and created what you're seeing on the screen right now. It's a bulletin of sorts. We went, and it's entitled, "Why was your latent print request rejected?" This bulletin speaks exactly to the rejection process and lists out the 3 main buckets as to why rejections are typically occurring, and it even goes so far as to provide what that standard language is, so they know on the front end, this is what you're going to expect in this scenario. This is what you should expect in this scenario. And we've provided it to them. The latent print section ran a query of investigators who had received rejection emails, and we went ahead and provided this directly to the investigators in that query. And so number 1, the hope is to educate them about our rejection process, right? Because an educated stakeholder is the ideal stakeholder. But number 2, because we've provided them with this bulletin, our hope is that they will be able to use it as a future reference, so that if in fact they do get one of these rejection emails and they still have any kind of cause for confusion, they can go back to this bulletin that we provided them, and hopefully it will be able to clear up any of the uncertainty that they might still have. And so again, while the respondent in this particular survey didn't say they were satisfied, or rather said that they were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, I would say that their feedback was of the utmost importance because it pointed out a blind spot to us. We got to see our processes from our stakeholders' point of view, and we were able to make an improvement based upon that, regardless of the fact that we don't even know the specific person that gave that feedback. And so again, yes, we got an anonymous survey that didn't make any sense, but all told, the value of this survey has proved to far outweigh that one anonymous survey that left us scratching our heads. Are there any questions that I can answer about our survey feedback? Okay. And we have our testimony data. And so for our transcript review project, the second round of transcripts was requested in June, and in July we received 12 transcripts. That's the most amount of transcripts we've received in one foul swoop so far. We've already begun the review process. The committees have been formed, deadlines have been communicated, and so that system or that process is already undergoing. And as far as jury trials go, an update for the board, jury trials have been suspended through October 1st. Now, within the month of July, we did have 2 staff members testify remotely, but those were in hearings. One was utilizing the Zoom software, and the other was done over the phone. Both staff members were monitored. The staff member who was using Zoom was able to, with the permission of the court, forward that Zoom link to the monitoring analyst, and both were able to access it, and the monitoring was able to take place. The one over the telephone, again, was able to be monitored. Speakerphone was utilized, and the monitor was able to listen to the questions being asked, and obviously as well as the responses being given. So while we haven't had any testimonies in jury trials, again, we're hopeful that these successful remote testimonies might influence whether or not remote testimony will be a possibility for jury trials, but we will essentially have to wait and see. Just informationally, both staff members said that the remote testimony was a positive experience they were able to circumnavigate having to transport themselves down to the courthouse. And also, as they waited to testify, one of them waited about 2 hours before being able to actually, the feed went live and they were actually to testify. They were both able to maintain their productivity at work and busy themselves with other things that they normally wouldn't get done if they were down at the courthouse just waiting to testify. So again, 2 positive experiences, and we're hopeful for the future, and we'll keep the board informed. And last, we have the detailed data. Are there any questions that I can answer for the board?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I really liked getting that survey result, and it did result in something that was able to give feedback to our stakeholders that I think was useful, and then change some of our work processes to make us more efficient. Will we be seeing more survey results like this in the future?
Meaning, will I be sharing them with the board?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'd like to see that as a regular part of your presentation if possible.
Okay,
I'm sure,
absolutely.
Sure, it depends on how many results you get back.
No, but absolutely. I can certainly include that moving forward. Thank you so much for the feedback.
Thank you.
Okay, does anyone else have any other questions for Ms. Zemek? Okay, well, we are now at the end of our agenda. This was a long meeting, but we had a lot of really, really good information that was shared with us today by everyone. And thank you all for preparing such detailed reports. I would like to, it's going to be time for adjournment. So I'd like to call for a motion to adjourn. This is everyone's favorite part, I know.
I so moved.
All right. Ms. Maxwell, Lois made the motion to adjourn. Second?
Second.
Second.
Okay, Mr. Hilder had our second. So this will be a voice vote. So all in favor, say aye.
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 Anyone opposed and want to keep going? Okay, the ayes have it. So our meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you next month at the next meeting.
Thank you, and stay safe.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great
Thank you.
weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.